There was a time when Michigan was the engine of the entire American economy. If you owned a car, and almost every American did, there was a good chance it was built here, in these towns, by these people. At its peak, the auto industry didn't just provide jobs. It built schools, funded hospitals, filled stadiums, and turned small Midwestern towns into places people actually wanted to raise a family. Then it left. And what it left behind is something most Americans have never seen and most news cameras never bother to show. These are 10 Michigan towns that the auto industry built and then quietly abandoned. Flint. Most people have heard the name Flint, but most people don't actually understand what happened here. Flint was once one of the most prosperous cities in America. General Motors built its empire here. At the peak, over 80,000 people worked in GM plants in Flint alone. The wages were good, the benefits were real, and the city reflected that. Solid homes, packed schools, a downtown that actually functioned. Then, GM started leaving. Slowly at first, then all at once. By the 1980s, tens of thousands of jobs were gone. The tax base collapsed. The city started cutting everything it could. In 2014, in an attempt to save money, city officials switched Flint's water source to the Flint River without properly treating it. The water corroded the pipes. Lead leached into the drinking water of nearly 100,000 residents, including thousands of children. The people who caused it largely faced no real consequences. The people who lived through it are still living through it. Flint's population has dropped from 200,000 at its peak to under 80,000 today. And the story of what happened here isn't really about water. It's about what happens to a city after the industry that built it decides it's no longer needed. Highland Park. If you've ever driven a Ford Model T or seen one in a museum, it was likely built in Highland Park. This is where Henry Ford perfected the moving assembly line. This is where mass production of the automobile was born. For a brief moment in the early 20th century, Highland Park was at the center of the modern world. Ford eventually moved operations to the ROUGE complex, and Highland Park never recovered from that decision. Today, Highland Park is a city of about 8,000 people, down from a peak of nearly 50,000. It is completely surrounded by the city of Detroit, but it is its own municipality. And for years, it was one of the most financially distressed cities in the entire United States. In 2011, facing total fiscal collapse, Highland Park made a decision that shocked people across the country. The city began removing its streetlights, physically pulling them out of the ground to sell them back to the power company and eliminate the electricity bill. Entire neighborhoods went dark. The city that lit up the American automobile industry couldn't afford to keep its own streets lit. Pontiac. In 1926, General Motors established the Pontiac division right here in the city of the same name. For decades, this was a company town in the most literal sense. GM didn't just employ people here. GM was Pontiac. The Silverdome was built here in 1975, a massive 80,000-seat stadium that hosted Super Bowls, NFL games, and even a papal mass when Pope John Paul II visited in 1987. It was a symbol of what Pontiac could be. When GM collapsed and restructured in 2009, Pontiac took a direct hit. Dealerships closed, plants shut down, tax revenue evaporated. The Silverdome sat empty for years. In 2017, it was sold at auction for $583,000. The original construction cost in 1975 was $55.7 million. The stadium that once held 80,000 people sold for less than the price of a luxury apartment in Manhattan. Pontiac's population has fallen by more than half since its peak. Entire commercial corridors sit empty. And the city that once had its name on one of America's most iconic car brands now struggles to keep basic services running. Saginaw. At its height, Saginaw had nearly 100,000 residents and some of the highest manufacturing wages in Michigan. General Motors, Buick, and dozens of supplier plants all had a presence here. Then came the layoffs, the plant closures, the population flight. Today, Saginaw has fewer than 40,000 people. That's a 60% population loss, not over centuries, but over decades. What that kind of population loss looks like on the ground is hard to describe. Entire streets where every other house is either abandoned or demolished. Neighborhoods where the lots are empty but the sidewalks are still there, sidewalks that lead to nothing. For years, Saginaw held the grim distinction of being one of the most dangerous cities in America per capita. Not because the people who stayed are dangerous, but because concentrated poverty, abandoned infrastructure, and gutted public services create conditions that are almost impossible to recover from. The city has tried. There have been revitalization plans, downtown investment efforts, new developments. Some have made small differences. But when 60,000 people leave a city, the math becomes almost impossible to fix. HAMTRAMCK. HAMTRAMCK is one of the strangest places in Michigan, and that's saying something. It is a fully independent city with its own mayor and city council, completely surrounded by the city of Detroit. You can drive into Detroit and, without realizing it, pass through HAMTRAMCK and re-enter Detroit, all within a few minutes. HAMTRAMCK was built almost entirely around the Dodge Main plant, which opened in 1910. At its peak, Dodge Main employed tens of thousands of workers, many of them Polish and Ukrainian immigrants who built tight-knit communities here. When Dodge Main closed in 1980, it didn't just eliminate jobs. It eliminated the entire economic logic of the city's existence. The plant sat vacant for years before being demolished. In its place is now a mostly empty lot. HAMTRAMCK has reinvented itself in some ways. It has attracted waves of new immigrant communities and has a unique cultural character unlike anywhere else in Michigan. But the population is roughly a third of what it was at its peak, and the city has struggled financially for decades. It is a place that survived, but survival and thriving are very different things. River Rouge. The Ford River Rouge complex was, at one point, the largest industrial complex in the world. At its peak in the 1930s, it employed over 100,000 workers. Raw materials came in one end, iron ore, coal, rubber, finished cars came out the other. Everything in between happened inside those walls. The city of River Rouge grew up around the plant. Workers needed somewhere to live, somewhere to eat, somewhere to spend their wages. The city existed because the plant existed. The plant still operates today, but with a fraction of its former workforce. Automation replaced tens of thousands of jobs. The supply chain restructured. What once required 100,000 workers now requires a few thousand. The city of River Rouge today has about 7,000 people, down significantly from its mid-century peak. The neighborhoods closest to the plant are among the most economically distressed in the region. There is also the environmental reality. Decades of heavy industrial activity left contamination in the soil and the air that residents are still living with today. River Rouge is a place that gave everything to the industrial economy, and when that economy moved on, it didn't take care of the people it left behind. Bay City. Stand on the corner of Washington Avenue and 3rd Street in downtown Bay City on a Tuesday afternoon. There are buildings here that were clearly beautiful once. Detailed brickwork, wide storefronts with tall windows, the kind of architecture that tells you people here believe this place had a future. Now count the empty ones. Bay City sits about 100 miles north of Detroit, where the Saginaw River meets the bay. For most of the 20th century, it was exactly what it looked like, a working city that worked. Auto parts, industrial supply chains, steady wages. What makes Bay City different from the other towns on this list is that it never had one catastrophic moment. No single plant closure that everyone remembers, no water crisis, no bankruptcy that made national news. It just gradually became less necessary. And there's something about that kind of decline that's harder to fight, because there's no villain to be angry at, no decision to point to. Just the slow accumulation of smaller losses, year after year, until one day you look up and 40% of downtown is vacant, and you can't quite explain how it happened. The buildings are still beautiful. They're just waiting for something that keeps not arriving. Muskegon Heights. On a single day in June 2012, every teacher in Muskegon Heights was fired. Not laid off, not reassigned, fired. Because the school district that employed them had legally ceased to exist. Facing debts it could never repay and a financial collapse decades in the making, Muskegon Heights became the first school district in American history to hand its entire public school system over to a private charter company to operate. Think about what that means. Parents dropped their kids off at school one year, the next year, the school was technically a private business. This didn't happen in a vacuum. Muskegon Heights was built around furniture, manufacturing, and later auto supply chains. As those industries left, the population dropped by nearly half. Fewer people meant less tax revenue. Less revenue meant cuts to schools. Cuts to schools meant the families who could leave did, which meant fewer people, which meant less revenue. The charter experiment eventually failed and the public schools came back. But the conditions that forced that decision in the first place, the poverty, the population loss, the hollowed out tax base, those didn't go anywhere. Muskegon Heights didn't make that decision because anyone wanted to. It made that decision because it had run out of every other option. Benton Harbor. There is a bridge in southwestern Michigan that is maybe 500 feet long. On one side is Street Joseph, a clean lakefront town with boutique shops, restaurants, and median household incomes well above the national average, the kind of place people drive to on weekends. On the other side is Benton Harbor. Same river, same lake, same geography, different worlds. Benton Harbor's manufacturing economy, anchored by Whirlpool and its suppliers, collapsed over decades as jobs moved elsewhere. The population fell from nearly 19,000 to under 9,000. At various points, it has been measured as one of the poorest cities in the entire United States. Here's what that actually meant for the people living there. The grocery stores left. Not because residents didn't need food, but because the business math didn't work in a city with that level of poverty. Residents without cars had to arrange rides across that 500-foot bridge into Street Joseph just to buy groceries. Two communities, one bridge, and an economic divide so stark you can see it from satellite imagery. Benton Harbor is not a story about people failing. It's a story about what happens when an economy withdraws from a place completely and nobody fills the gap. Monroe. Monroe doesn't have a famous disaster. No contaminated water, no historic bankruptcy, no moment that put it on the national news. If you search for Monroe, Michigan, you'll mostly find information about its history, a battle fought here in 1812, the birthplace of General Custer. What you won't find is much about what Monroe is now. Drive through on a weekday and you'll notice it in small ways. A downtown that has the bones of something that used to be busier. Storefronts, where you can tell a new business opened with genuine optimism and then closed quietly a year later. Streets that feel just slightly too wide for the amount of traffic on them, designed for a population that isn't quite there anymore. Monroe was never a boomtown. It was just a solid, working town that made things, auto parts, paper, industrial components, and provided a decent life for the people who lived there. Ford had a major presence here for decades. As that economy contracted, Monroe contracted with it, slowly, without drama. The young people leave for college, and the math of coming back doesn't add up. The median age rises a little every year. The tax base shrinks a little every year. And the town keeps going. It functions. It just functions at a lower level than it was built for. That quiet kind of decline is easy to overlook because it doesn't announce itself. But if you spend an afternoon walking around Monroe, you can feel it. The gap between what this place was supposed to become and what it actually is. That gap exists in hundreds of towns across Michigan, across the Midwest, across America. And most of the time, nobody talks about it. These 10 towns didn't fail because the people in them weren't working hard enough. They failed because the industry that built them, that needed them, decided it didn't need them anymore. And when that happened, no one came to replace what was lost. The auto industry didn't just build cars in Michigan. It built communities, identities, and a version of the American working class life that felt stable and real. When it left, it took all of that with it. And the towns it left behind are still figuring out what comes next. If you found this video worthwhile, subscribe, because there are hundreds of towns across America with stories just like these, and most of them never get told.